Well, welcome back to our class on Unshakable Faith, a study of Hebrews chapter 11 mainly, but we draw on a lot of other scriptures as well. I hope you've had a good week. I really appreciate your taking time to tune in with us and watch this video study, enter into the study together. Uh, I want to just review a little bit from where we were last time, and if you had a chance, the email you got regarding this class had an attachment, a handout on it. So if you want to follow along, just pause and go get your handout or pencil, piece of paper, Bible, whatever you need, cup of coffee, and then you can start me up again, and we'll rejoin each other. So the review for this time calls attention to the two verses that we talked about last time. In particular, verse 31, Hebrews 11:31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And we have this little phrase, by faith, throughout the book, throughout the chapter 11 of Hebrews. And so the Hebrew writer stresses that all these great deeds were done by faith because people had faith. James, on the other hand, I referred to James chapter 2 as being something of a commentary here, and it calls out the example of Rahab. It says in verse 25 of I'm going to start in verse 24, James 2, and again, it's in the box on your sheet there. You see that a person is considered righteous not by what they do. I'm sorry, let's try that again. You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. Is there how do we reconcile these two? Is there a conflict here? Do we need to reconcile these two passages some way? And just to be really, maybe put too fine a point on it, Hebrews 11 says it's all about faith. With faith, you have motivation to do all these great things. James says, well, faith is good, but your faith is dead and worthless if you don't combine it with deeds, or some of the older translations say works, activities, action, physical movement, doing something. Just having the mental assent, the mental exercise of faith, according to James, is not enough. So, what's going on here? The contrast between James and the other epistles is something that people have wrestled with for centuries, particularly the contrast between James and Paul's writings, principally in Romans and Galatians, where Paul writes earnestly that works that deeds are not what save us. And principally, he's arguing against the Jewish idea that you have to be circumcised, you have to keep the law of Moses. But he uses Abraham as an example. Says Abraham was justified by faith, that when Abraham believed, it says God credited him with righteousness before he was ever circumcised or anything else happened, just as soon as he had the mental assent. James, on the other hand, seems to take a different tack. I think Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer of the 1500s, just wanted to take James out of the Bible entirely. He just felt like it's no way to reconcile. It was off base. Perhaps one way to look at this, first of all, is Hebrews 11 says that real faith has got to produce action. That real faith, really believing, really trusting, is going to make inaction impossible. Well, what about James? James says, well, if you have faith, but you don't have deeds, as if it were possible to have faith without deeds. Some people have reconciled this. In fact, some translations, English translations, have reconciled this by going into James and in statements like, you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. They actually put quotation marks around the word faith, as if James is being sarcastic. He says, You're considered righteous when you really get moving, when you step out and when you do something to show your faith, not by phony faith, faith alone, this, so-called faith. In the same way they put quotation marks around faith in the statement. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. I offer that as a possible explanation. As I said, theologians have argued about this and reasoned about this, and Christians have struggled with this for centuries. And so I just leave it with you. Maybe you can come up with a better solution than I have. At any rate, we are focusing on Hebrews 11, and complementary to James chapter 2, it talks about the fact that if you have an unshakable faith, that you will keep going in the face of terrible misfortune, terrible odds, terrible hardship, terrible suffering, terrible persecution. Somehow you keep on going. And so that brings us to today's text. Four very interesting, complex, conflicted characters who faced tremendous opposition. And so we'll just read it. So we're going to start in verse 32. And the Hebrew writer says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets." This is one of the reasons why a lot of people think that Hebrews was originally a spoken sermon. Because if you're writing, maybe you're in prison and there's evidence the Hebrew writer was in prison when he wrote this, you got time on your hands, okay? And so your listeners may not have time to listen to it, but you don't say, well, I don't have time to write all this other stuff to you. But so maybe it was kind of like a sermon, but he says there's so many great examples in the Old Testament. So we've gone through Abel, and we've gone through Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and so forth. Now we get to the book of Judges, Joshua, and then we get Rahab. Now we get to the book of Judges, and instead of giving a verse or two on each one of these heroes, he just lists these four judges all in a row, and then he puts in David and Samuel. We won't talk much about David and Samuel today. We're going to focus on these four judges, and the word judges doesn't mean like a Supreme Court judge for us today. It's used more like a leader. Now, I think they did settle disputes, but they were moral teachers in some cases, but they were also great political, military, and spiritual leaders. So Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. So what I've asked you to do on your sheet here is give the greatest accomplishment of each one of these judges. Now, the book of Judges deals with a cycle. People are right with God, they are enthusiastic about their religion, things are going good, and they gradually become more prosperous, and they turn away from God. The allure of idol worship, of sensual pagan religion, of prosperity, of peer pressure always gets them. And so when they wander away from God, God allows some of their enemies to come in and oppress them, conquer them, take them, burn their crops, kill their livestock, rape their wives, take the babies away. Horrible kind of stuff, okay? Not nice people. The people cry out. They cry out in their suffering, and then God will raise up a leader that they call a judge. He will lead the people to defeat their enemies, and they enter a period of peace and prosperity again, and then the cycle repeats itself. So Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, each were great military leaders, and they won great victories. Gideon defeated the Midianites with just 300 men. That's his accomplishment. Barak, and this Barak or Barak is not the 43rd president of the United States, in case you're wondering. It's a little bit before that, and besides, he doesn't have a C in his name, so it's Barak. Barak defeated a Canaanite army led by a general named Sisera. Samson defeated the Philistines repeatedly, a man capable of nearly superhuman strength. And then Jephthah, and his name is really hard to spell because it has 3 H's in it. See if you can find them. Jephthah. And he defeated the Ammonites. So 4 different pagan people surrounding God's people, and these guys lead them to great military victories. And military history is fascinating to me. I love to read military history, particularly about the Civil War. And Oxford was invaded by the Northern Army in 1862, about Christmas time, and they had to leave in a hurry because, well, anyway, I won't get all the military history, but they had to leave in a hurry. But the famous General Grant, who later became our president, was right here in Oxford. In 1864, the Yankees came back and burned Oxford. At the very beginning of the war in 1861, before all this invasion stuff occurred, the university, every single student at the university volunteered to serve in the Southern Army, and a lot of men in Lafayette County and Oxford who were not in the university also, and they shipped out to Virginia where a lot of the early fighting occurred. So the war makes a deep impression on any society, on any culture, on any country, and for good reason. And it's true, worldwide that people have a collective memory of the wars that their people have suffered through. Uh, this is a collection that I prize very dearly of bullets that were fired around Vicksburg in the Civil War. Dear brother in Christ, his son Harris, gave these to me when I was a member of the Vicksburg Church of Christ, and he was part of my faith family, one of our shepherds, as a matter of fact. And these are about a half inch in diameter. They're conical in shape, and they were fired out of muskets, of course. About a half inch in diameter, so going in, that was the size. Coming out, it would make a hole about the size of your fist. Soft lead bullet, so it flattens out when it strikes something like this guy right here. Anyway, I won't go into that too much, but just to say this: when we write military history, like what happened in Oxford and about the mini balls in Vicksburg, we usually stress the resources, the number of men, the weapons that they had available, the tactics, the strategy, how good the generals were, how smart they were, the railroads, the airplanes, the bombs, how it all worked out. The book of Judges, although it has all this military stuff in it, doesn't tell the story that way at all. Instead, it's all about what God does. And people win great victories because of what God does or doesn't do. When they rely on themselves, usually things don't go well. When the people have a great spiritual awakening, and that's the great thing about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, although they were deeply flawed individuals, they all led spiritual revivals, and the writer of Judges says, and that's why they won the battle. It's because they just did what God said do, and they trusted Him, and they had faith, and they put away their idols, and they decided to do the right thing, and boom, they won victories. So it's a completely different way to write military history than what we normally do. Well, the Hebrew writer doesn't tell the whole story. Well, he says he didn't have time to tell the whole story, but he doesn't tell the whole story, and he didn't tell you the whole story about Abraham, for example. That he said his wife was his sister because he was afraid that and he doesn't tell the whole story about Jacob, how Jacob deceived his father-in-law, was crooked, had 4 wives, 13 kids by 4 wives. He doesn't tell about the failures and failings of a lot of folks. Particularly these. Well, why doesn't he tell us that stuff? Is he trying to, sugarcoat everything? Well, one thing you notice about the Hebrew writer, he expects that we've done the reading, that we already know the Old Testament. So he figures we know all this stuff already, and we can think for ourselves and think, hey, God used these imperfect people to do something great. We're not going to get into David and Samuel, but boy, you want a case of the man after God's own heart. He wrote half the Psalms? I don't know. And he committed adultery with a woman, got her pregnant, and had her husband murdered, killed. This is David, okay? And so there's a strange mix here of heroic faith and heroic failure. I want to talk about each one of these 4 guys just briefly here. For example, Gideon. And Gideon is just such a great character. There's a whole chapter about Gideon entitled "Fleeced" in Les Ferguson's book, Still Struggling. And what's his moral failure? Well, we learn very early on in the story of Gideon that his family is steeped in idol worship. but he takes a stand against it. He tears up the idols, burns things, and desecrates the idol altar and makes a stand for worshiping the one true God, Jehovah. However, after Gideon's great victory over the Midianite army, he makes an ephod. Now, frankly, I can't find anybody that says they're exactly sure what this thing was that Gideon made, but we know he made it out of gold jewelry, and we know that people worshipped it. Okay, so it was a golden object, garment, object, statue, we don't know, idol, probably, and people worshipped it. How could he do this? He had 70 sons, I know you're glad to hear this, a lot of different women. So he had a lot of different women and a concubine and so forth. Not exactly the best family man you could ever think of. And furthermore, one of the sons killed all the others after Gideon died. So how's that for a harmonious family? So Gideon had some spectacular failures. There was a civil war that occurred after, so he didn't create a great sense of national unity. So some colossal failures. Barak, actually a pretty successful guy. He won the military campaign against the Canaanite army and Sisera. But at that time, there was a woman. This was remarkable. I think the only woman that was a judge, maybe, I think about the only one in the book of Judges, named Deborah. Maybe you know a woman named Deborah. Comes right from the book of Judges. She was the judge, meaning she was the moral and spiritual leader. We might even say she was kind of a political leader, and putting it in our terms. And she told this guy, Barak, who's a military leader, you go fight these guys, you can win a victory. And he says, well, I'll go if you'll go with me. And the book of Judges doesn't comment on this a lot, but it kind of portrays it as a weakness, as a failure of Barak, because Deborah says, well, I will, but you're not going to get credit for the victory. So she was kind of disappointed in him in his unwillingness to get out from behind her skirt, so to speak. That'd be a little bit hard on the guy, but that's just the way the book of Judges says it. They don't say it that way. They don't use that expression. But what I'm trying to say is it kind of portrays Barak as being less than entirely successful because he relied so heavily on Deborah. Then Samson. Where do we begin? Well, we really don't have time to talk about him because he had so many women. He had no self-control at all. But physically, he was a man of superhuman strength, maybe the strongest man that ever lived. Despite his huge physical strength, he could not control his inner urges. He could not control his own lust. And so one woman after the other would mislead him and get him into bad situations. And finally, it led to his weakness and his being captured by the Philistines. So he's a study. And what we see around us so many times today, men who are great athletes, great politicians, great scientists, often are very weak when it comes to keeping their vows of faithfulness to one woman. Finally, we get to Jephthah, who starts off the story saying, well, this guy was the son of a prostitute. And so his half-brothers threw him out after his father died and said, you're not one of us. So, kind of a dysfunctional family there. But the horrible thing about Jephthah is that he made a rash vow to God and said, if you will let my army win this victory, when I come back, the first thing that comes out of my house to meet me, I'll offer as a burnt offering. Well, of course, it was his only child, a daughter, and the text indicates that he did offer her as a burnt offering. The book of Judges is full of shocking, dysfunctional things. If we made a real movie out of it, it would be rated R or X because of the horrible stuff in it. So a great failure on the part of Jephthah. Just to kind of top all that off, he got the people involved in a civil war. They got involved in civil war. It wasn't necessarily all his doing, but he was unable to lead them away from that kind of conflict. So, what does all this mean? What does all this mean? By faith, the Hebrew writer says, these people conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised. And then he kind of, he brings in some other characters out of the Old Testament in the next few phrases that maybe you can recognize, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Certainly all four of these guys, they fill the bill on that. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Why didn't God pick somebody who had their head on straight instead of Gideon? Why did he pick Samson to bless him with this incredible superhuman strength, and I would argue in some ways intelligence also? If he was going to be such a sexual immoral failure, why did God do this? Somebody says, it shows that God grades on the curve. And I can do a lot of bad things, but if I do some good things too, I can get into the Faith Hall of Fame just like these guys did. Well, maybe, but I wouldn't bet on it if I were you, okay? I think it shows, though, the importance of faith, that God can take very deeply flawed, sinful people with a little bit of faith and do great things, I think that we tend to count ourselves out when we fail too soon. The battle's not over. The war's not over. We can lose a battle, but not lose the war. On the other hand, we can make the other mistake that, say, Gideon made. We can win a great battle. We can win a great campaign, but guess what? Satan doesn't give up. We can beat him and stomp on his head and send him away, and he will ooze around behind us, and before you know it, there's all this gold, and we make an ephod out of it, because wouldn't that be a classy thing to have? And so the fight is not over until it's over. Our faith, to be unshakable, needs to be consistent all the way to the end. We can't rest on our laurels, or we can't say, I'm no good, I'm disqualified, I'm out of it. Instead, Hebrews 11 encourages us to just keep on going. Other heroes that may be referenced in this passage, of course, Daniel in the book of Daniel shut the mouths of lions. His companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, quenched the fury of the flames. Both Elijah and Elisha raised family members, children, and gave them back to women, and so they received back their dead again, as it says here in verse 35. So I hope this week is encouraging and inspirational to you. I have maybe about 6 minutes left. And so I'd like to just zoom in, if I could, on one of these four judges, one of these four heroes, to what I consider to be one of the more interesting events in his life. And that's at the very beginning of the story of Gideon, chapter 6 in Judges. And so times are really hard. If the economic downturn that we have here causes you to lose all of your savings, all of your retirement, all of your home, your car, your business, your job, whatever it is, that's going to be pretty terrible. And I hope and pray it won't happen to any of us. But imagine if you were living back in Gideon's time, when the Midianites swoop in and they burn your crops. They take whatever grain you have stored. They either kill your donkeys, your sheep, your cattle, or they take them off. And then you turn around and look at your little children and you wonder, what am I going to feed them? What am I going to feed them through the winter? What will there be? A great moment in our movie Gone with the Wind, the story of the Civil War. And this very wealthy woman, her land has been despoiled. Her parents are now mentally feeble. the slaves don't know what to do, and she goes out behind the house. She's so hungry. She's been traveling, trying to get back home. When she gets back home, this is what she finds. And the only thing that she can find are some radishes growing in the garden. And she pulls these up, these radishes, and eats them. Well, I could go on and on about that movie. I'm not going to. But anyway, that's how hard it is for Gideon. And the scene opens, and he's down in a wine press, basically a stone-lined hole, okay? And he's trying to thresh out some wheat, trying to separate the wheat from the straw so the Midianites won't find it down there and take it away from him. He's really desperate. And boom, an angel of the Lord appears to him. And the angel says, "Greetings, mighty warrior, the Lord is with you." That's kind of funny to me. Here's a guy hiding in a hole, trying to get enough grain to make a meal out of, and the angel says, "You're a mighty warrior." But that's not what Gideon notices. He notices the phrase, "God is with you." He said, "Wait a minute." He said, "If God is with me, why am I down in this hole?" I've heard all these stories about how God, sent plagues on the Egyptians and how he helped the people cross the Red Sea and cross the Jordan, and the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. They conquered them, and now the enemies just sweep over us. They take whatever they want. Why, if he's with us, what's going on around here? He said, "I've got a box the way that God is supposed to behave. And he's not in the box, okay? He's not doing his job. I'm doing my job. He's not doing his job." Well, if we approach God that way, if our faith is built on a God who behaves the way we think he ought to behave all the time, then our faith is going to fail. Furthermore, we get into the mighty warrior thing. The angel says, "Look, you can do it. You're the man. Go in the strength you have and defeat the Midianites." And Gideon says, "Are you kidding me? My clan is the least in the tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family." Okay. So what he's saying is my university isn't in the top 25, and I'm not even tenure track. I'm the most junior person in my department. That's how we would say it in the university world. We could say my company is not Fortune 500. I don't even have the top. I'm not the top salesman. I'm nobody. Okay, get this, Lord. I drive the smallest car. I live in the shortest trailer. I'm not who you're looking for. But the angel says, "Oh yes, you're the one, and we're going to do this." And so there ensues kind of a back and forth about that. At any rate, I think about this mighty warrior down the hole. And maybe that's where you are. Mighty warrior down the hole. So I hope that idea is encouraging to you. Next week, we'll continue our study of Unshakable Faith, and I hope you can join us then. We're going to talk some about a suffering faith, I believe, and we'll look forward to continuing that study with you then.